January 5, 1943, 11,200 feet above the Solomon Sea, Captain Minoru Genda watches the horizon. Captain Minoru Genda stood in the operations room aboard the carrier Zuikaku, his face illuminated by the pale glow of nautical charts spread across the plotting table. Outside, the tropical sun beat mercilessly on the flight deck where 18 Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers prepared for sortie. Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and now senior staff officer of Carrier Division 1, permitted himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Intelligence reports indicated an American task force operating 70 nautical miles northeast, escorting transports bound for Guadalcanal. The morning air hung thick with humidity, and the acrid smell of aviation fuel as deck crews secured 800-kilogram Type 91 torpedoes beneath fuselages still warm from the equatorial heat. "The Americans still fire like they're shooting at clay pigeons," remarked Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Sadamu, tapping a casualty report from the previous month's engagement near Rennell Island. His flight had penetrated the screening destroyers with acceptable losses, 12 aircraft expended for one enemy cruiser badly damaged. The mathematics favored continuation. Genda nodded slowly, though something in the newest reconnaissance photographs troubled him in ways he could not articulate. The American formations looked tighter somehow, more deliberately arranged. He dismissed the thought. Japanese naval aviation had ruled these waters for 18 months through superior training, tactical flexibility, and the crucible of combat experience that had forged his pilots into the finest carrier aviators in the world. The Americans possessed numbers, certainly, production capacity that staggered the imagination, but numbers meant little when shells required direct contact to kill. The sky was vast. Aircraft were small. Mathematics favored the attacker. For 20 months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviators had executed their doctrine with devastating precision. At Coral Sea in May 1942, at Midway 1 month later despite catastrophic carrier losses, and throughout the grinding Guadalcanal campaign, the fundamental calculus of aerial combat remained constant. American 5-inch .38 caliber guns threw proximity-fused shells at attacking aircraft with respectable velocity and rate of fire, but those shells detonated only upon impact or after their timed fuses expired. A bomber approaching at 240 knots through a defensive barrage faced a simple geometric problem. The probability of a direct hit against a maneuvering target measured less than 4% per shell fired, even at optimal range. Japanese tactical training emphasized the exploitation of this fundamental limitation. Pilots approached at varying altitudes and vectors, forcing defensive fire to distribute across three-dimensional space. They jinked and weaved, presenting difficult deflection angles. They accepted losses as a percentage gain where aggressive execution and numerical persistence guaranteed penetration. Between December 1941 and December 1942, Japanese carrier aviation sank or damaged 43 American capital ships, from battleships at Pearl Harbor to carriers at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, all while operating at the extreme edge of logistical sustainability. The doctrine worked because the laws of ballistics were immutable, or so every naval aviator from Hiroshima to Yokosuka had been taught. But in the laboratories of Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory and the cramped workshops of Section T at the National Defense Research Committee, American scientists had been wrestling with a problem that existed at the intersection of physics, miniaturization, and mass production. The proximity fuse, designated VT for variable time to conceal its true nature, represented an unprecedented fusion of technologies. A miniature radar transmitter, vacuum tubes hardened to withstand 20,000 G-forces during gun launch, a receiver sensitive enough to detect reflected radio waves from an aircraft's metal skin, and a firing circuit that could process this information and trigger detonation in microseconds. All contained within a package measuring 203 mm in length and 127 mm in diameter. The technical specifications read like science fiction. Each fuse contained 5 vacuum tubes manufactured with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, powered by a battery that activated only after the shell's rotation armed the device in flight. The radio transmitter operated at 180 to 220 MHz, sending out continuous waves that reflected off approaching targets. When the Doppler shifted, return signal indicated proximity within lethal fragmentation range, typically 20 to 30 feet, the fuse fired. February 18, 1943, south of Bougainville Island. Lieutenant Shigeru Murata led 9 Aichi D-3A dive bombers toward an American destroyer formation that had been harassing Japanese supply runs for 3 weeks. Murata was a veteran of 37 combat missions, a careful pilot who understood angles and closure rates with mathematical precision. His approach was textbook: shallow descent from 8,000 feet, airspeed maintained at 230 knots, 15-degree dive angle to complicate anti-aircraft tracking solutions. The American ships opened fire at 6,200 yards, black puffs of 5-inch shells blooming in clusters that looked no different than 100 previous engagements. Then the sky changed. Shells that should have passed harmlessly 50 yards to his left exploded with perfect timing, fragmenting into steel hornets that shredded his port wing fabric and punctured his oil cooler. Murata's wingman, Petty Officer Nakamura, simply disintegrated as 3 shells detonated in a bracketing pattern that should have been statistically impossible. No impacts, just proximity bursts that anticipated movement with eerie prescience. Of 9 aircraft that began the attack run, only 2 reached torpedo release range. Murata returned to Rabaul with 73 fragment holes in his aircraft, and a report that his superiors initially dismissed as combat stress. Shells that exploded near misses. Impossible. Anti-aircraft fire required contact. This was known. But the reports multiplied. March 4th, north of Kolombangara, a 16-plane strike lost 9 aircraft to defensive fire from a single cruiser. March 29th, near the Russell Islands, an entire chutai of torpedo bombers disintegrated in a defensive barrage that seemed to anticipate every evasive maneuver. Flight leaders reported the same phenomenon, shells detonating at optimal fragmentation range without direct hits, creating overlapping kill zones that turned previously survivable approach corridors into gauntlets of precisely timed explosions. Japanese intelligence officers interviewed survivors with growing concern. The descriptions were consistent. The new American shells left different fragmentation patterns, tighter groupings that suggested detonation at specific calculated distances rather than the random distribution of timed fuses. At Combined Fleet Headquarters in Truk Lagoon, Captain Yasumi Doi examined the mounting evidence with the systematic rigor of a trained engineer. Doi had studied electrical engineering at Tokyo Imperial University before the war and understood radio propagation theory. The possibility of a miniaturized radar fuse had been theoretically discussed in pre-war Japanese academic circles but dismissed as practically impossible. The vacuum tubes required would never survive the shock of firing. The power requirements exceeded what battery technology could deliver in such compact space. The manufacturing precision necessary to produce such devices in quantity was beyond even American industrial capacity. Doi wrote in his analysis dated April 12, 1943, "The enemy has not violated physics, but they have perhaps redefined our understanding of what American engineering can achieve under pressure. We calculated their capabilities based on peacetime limitations. This may prove our gravest miscalculation." The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the proximity fuse's decisive impact on industrial scale. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched Operation Eigo with 430 carrier aircraft, the largest Japanese naval aviation strike since Midway. American Task Force 58 waited with 15 carriers whose anti-aircraft batteries were equipped almost exclusively with VT-fused ammunition. The results approached massacre. Japanese formations approaching the American fleet encountered defensive fire of unprecedented lethality. Shells detonated in precise patterns, creating kill zones that required no direct hits. Pilots who had survived 2 years of combat reported scenarios where evasive maneuvers became meaningless, where the sky itself seemed weaponized. Commander Masatake Okumiya, leading a strike group of 53 aircraft, watched his formation disintegrate in the space of 4 minutes. "The American fire was different," he later wrote in his memoir. "Not heavier but smarter. Their shells knew where we would be. Of 373 Japanese aircraft that engaged American forces that day, 243 never returned. American pilots dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the real killer wasn't American fighters. It was mathematics married to miniaturization, radar principles reduced to artillery shell dimensions, firing circuits that converted proximity into lethality in microseconds. By late 1944, as kamikaze tactics became Japan's final desperate gambit, the VT fuse transformed what had been conceived as an overwhelmingly effective tactic into a calculated slaughter. Kamikaze attacks required pilots to maintain steady courses during final approach, surrendering the very evasiveness that had previously offered survival probability. Against proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, these straight-line approaches became death runs through precisely timed explosive corridors. Of 2,525 kamikaze sorties launched during the Okinawa campaign, fewer than 14% achieved hits. The remainder died in defensive barrages where shells detonated at optimal range without requiring gunners to achieve direct contact. Vice Admiral Mato Migaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, wrote in his final diary entry before his own kamikaze mission on August 15, 1945. "We fly into skies that have become our enemy. The Americans have weaponized proximity itself." Post-war interrogations of Japanese technical officers revealed the profound psychological impact of a technology their doctrine had dismissed as science fiction. Commander Masatoshi Abe, chief of the Technical Research Division at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, examined captured VT fuses in September 1945 with the careful attention of an engineer studying his own obsolescence. "We understood the theory," he stated to American intelligence officers. "We simply did not believe you could manufacture such devices in quantities of millions. We calculated that the precision machining alone would require manufacturing capacity that exceeded your entire pre-war industrial base. We were correct about the difficulty. We were catastrophically wrong about your willingness to solve impossible problems through sheer industrial application." The numbers supported his assessment. Between 1943 and 1945, American industry produced over 22 million VT proximity fuses. Each contained components manufactured to tolerances that pre-war industrial standards considered economically impossible for expendable munitions. The miniature vacuum tubes underwent 127 separate manufacturing steps. The battery activation mechanism required springs wound to specifications measured in fractions of millimeters. The radio transmitter circuitry demanded soldering precision that required new training programs for thousands of workers. Yet American factories delivered these technological miracles at costs that decreased from $732 per unit in 1942 to $18 per unit by 1945, a demonstration of industrial learning curve optimization that foreign observers found almost as impressive as the technology itself. German technical intelligence reached similar conclusions after examining proximity fuses recovered from unexploded shells in 1944. Dr. Herbert Wagner, designer of the Henschel HS-293 guided bomb, wrote in a classified assessment, "The American proximity fuse represents a greater sustained tactical advantage than any single weapon system deployed by either side. The atomic bomb ended the war in 2 explosions. The proximity fuse killed thousands of aircraft across 3 years of combat operations. From an engineering perspective, the bomb proved a theoretical principle. The fuse proved industrial supremacy." The final accounting rendered its own verdict. Between January 1943 and August 1945, VT-fused anti-aircraft ammunition increased kill probability per shell fired by a factor of 5 compared to contact or timed fuses. In Pacific naval engagements, Japanese aircraft casualties from anti-aircraft fire increased from 4.7% per sortie in 1942 to 17.3% per sortie in 1944-45, when proximity fuses became standard ammunition. The kamikaze campaign, conceived as a force multiplier that would extract maximum damage from Japan's dwindling pilot pool, achieved hit rates below 15% against ships equipped with VT ammunition, compared to estimated 40% effectiveness that Japanese planners had projected based on 1942-era defensive capabilities. Captain Minoru Genda survived the war and later commanded Japan's Air Self-Defense Force, living until 1989. In a 1956 interview, he reflected on the proximity fused with the analytical distance of hindsight. "We prepared to fight the American Navy of 1941. They invented the Navy of 1944 faster than we could adapt. The proximity fuse was simply the most elegant example. We calculated what was possible. They redefined possibility. The invisible killer in the sky, the shell that knew proximity without contact, the technology that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as impossible, had shattered not just aircraft formations but the doctrine that had governed naval aviation since biplanes first flew off carrier decks. The mathematics of aerial combat had been rewritten by American engineers who refused to accept that miniaturization had limits, that precision had costs too high to bear, that the impossible was anything more than an engineering problem awaiting sufficient industrial determination. In the end, the most devastating surprise was not that America could build such weapons. It was that they could build 22 million of them.